And now, our feature presentation.
So, Zootopia 2 just recently concluded its run in theaters, and I think it's fair to say the film was a massive hit. In addition to the film getting glowing reviews from critics, including myself, as well as numerous award nominations, Walt Disney Animation Studios' latest sequel shattered box office records, becoming the highest grossing American animated film ever made, and the second highest grossing animated film of all time, just behind Ne Zha 2. I loved the film a whole lot, and it gave me everything that I hoped for from a Zootopia sequel, and it marked another massive triumph in the Disney animation catalog, one that I have watched and cherished ever since I was a kid, and I'm curious to see how it's expanded into the future, even if it hasn't always been perfect. Though, as Zootopia 2 was breaking all the records, getting all the praise, and even getting a few awards that weren't being won by K-pop demon hunters, there was a stray thought that had entered my mind regarding Disney and their sequels. A thought that I would never have considered all those years ago, and one that I couldn't get out of my head once it popped in. Maybe it was time for me to visit those direct-to-video Disney sequels. And I know you're all probably wondering, why? Why would you want to take a look at some of the most infamous animated films ever to bear the Disney name? Don't you think this is a little beneath you? Well, let me explain. Despite having grown up watching and loving the films from Disney Animation, I was never really familiar with the direct-to-video sequels that were made by Disney's smaller sibling studios. I watched only a select few as a kid, but they never really kept my attention as much as the originals. And as I got older and started to become more ingrained with watching, researching, and studying animation, I was very hesitant to look into them further. I knew of their infamous reputation with the public, animation historians, and fans. I knew that they weren't exactly good sequels, and given their direct-to-video nature, they were also very easy to ignore. I'm not someone who likes discussing direct-to-video movies, as I often feel they're low-hanging fruit and not exactly something you go into expecting high quality. It's like if I were a food critic and complained about how terrible a TV dinner was. I mean, it's a TV dinner. What did I think I was gonna get? But being the big Disney animation fan I am, my curiosity did eventually get the better of me, and I decided it was time to check them out, especially considering how it's been over 30 years since these films started, and almost 20 since they ended. Perhaps I could get something out of them. Maybe even find some merit to them. Now, I'm not going to be discussing every single one of these films individually, or ranking them from worst to best. Plenty of other people have already done that, and besides, that's not what I wanted to do for this video. I wanted to really look at these films as a cohesive whole, discuss the history on why they were made, why they stopped, what they added to the grand scheme of things in Disney history, and if they deserve the harsh legacy they have. I'm not sure what I'm going to discover, but it should be interesting nonetheless. So join me, why don't you, as I dust off the old VCR, pop in a cassette tape as we decode Disney's direct-to-video sequels. In 1984, Disney finally did something they had resisted doing for years. They started making animation for television. Although Disney had dabbled in the world of television decades earlier, starting in 1950, and the main animation division had made plenty of bits for Disney's various TV programs, they had never dabbled at trying a full-on animated TV series in the vein of Hanna-Barbera or Filmation, both of whom were thriving with shows airing on Saturday mornings. This was a precedent set by Walt himself, who just felt the high animation standards he had couldn't be accomplished on TV. But by the 1980s, as the way of What Would Walt Do went out and Michael Eisner and company came in, they decided it was finally time to branch Disney out further, hoping to revive the struggling company, which had plunged into a downward spiral in the 70s as the film industry prospered in the face of New Hollywood. And so, Disney launched the Walt Disney Pictures Television Animation Group, launching various shows on television from the likes of DuckTales, TaleSpin, Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, and Goof Troop. DuckTales would be the biggest breakout hit for the division, and Disney, inspired by the success of various other cartoons that had hit the big screen, decided to take a 5-episode saga and turn it into a full-length feature film. This would lead to the formation of a new studio called Disney Movie Tunes, which would help turn many of the shows airing on the Disney afternoon into films. In the end, only DuckTales and Goof Troop got feature films made, with DuckTales Treasures of the Lost Lamp in 1990 and a Goofy movie in 1995, both of which initially got mixed reviews and weren't exactly the biggest hits at the box office, though they're now seen as cult classics, a Goofy movie especially. While all that was happening, the main animation division, which had completely hit rock bottom with The Black Cauldron, was starting to get back on track with films like The Great Mouse Detective and Oliver and Company, before launching into the Disney Renaissance with The Little Mermaid, while their classic films from years past were finally starting to be released onto the new booming market of home video. The stars were starting to align, and it started to take shape by 1993.
Bonjour! 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 Bonjour!
By this point in time, Disney Animation were making films that became instant classics, and the television division had noticed. The year prior, they had recently turned The Little Mermaid into a prequel television show, and were looking for another film that could be worthy of that treatment. The studio settled on Aladdin, as it seemed like the perfect launching ground for more adventures with the characters. The Aladdin series was to be helmed by Tad Stones and Alan Zaslav, the same duo behind Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers and Darkwing Duck. The duo had fallen in love with the character of Iago and wanted him alongside Aladdin for the show, but therein lay a problem. Iago had been trapped in Jafar's lamp in the Cave of Wonders at the end of the film, so how were they going to get him out? They devised an idea for the pilot, which follows another lowly common thief accidentally freeing Jafar from his lamp and allowing him to seek revenge on Aladdin and Jasmine. And as the story grew, the team realized that it had the potential to be more than just your standard TV pilot. And with the massive success of the original film in theaters, they soon got an idea. Instead of premiering the show on TV, why not release this pilot arc straight to VHS and hype it up as a sequel to the film? The idea of releasing animated films direct to home video was starting to become a new trend, starting back in 1991 when Warner Brothers and Amblin decided to release Tiny Toon Adventures: How I Spent My Summer Vacation straight to home video rather than theaters, after Steven Spielberg realized there was more replay value for animated films at home than there was in theaters. And he was definitely onto something. So it seemed like this was a no-brainer option for Disney. But they weren't so sure yet. Before the release of Aladdin, the home video branch had virtually no interest in wanting to put the TV pilot out on VHS. Both Michael Eisner and Disney Animation's president Peter Schneider were also hesitant on the idea, feeling it could tarnish the Disney Animation brand. It wasn't until after Aladdin's massive success in theaters and Jeffrey Katzenberg being impressed by some of the dailies that the idea was eventually reconsidered. Eventually, the pilot was given the title The Return of Jafar, and was released onto home video shelves in the summer of 1994, with the marketing going all in on the fact that it was a home video exclusive.
Walt Disney Home Video presents the first all-new Disney animated movie produced exclusively for video.
That's right, if you wanted to see more Aladdin, you had to buy the VHS tape. You couldn't see it in theaters. And against all odds, the strategy worked. The film would sell 1.5 million copies in its first 2 days, and by the end of the year, it would sell more than 10 million, becoming one of the top grossers in the home media market, earning Disney at least $100 million for a film that only cost $3.5 million. Most critics may have scoffed at the film, but regardless, the commercial success was enough to efficiently launch the Aladdin show on television. The show would run for a full year, and its success would help get the series finale, Aladdin and the King of Thieves, a home video release in 1996, which was also able to bring back Robin Williams as the genie, who initially refused to reprise the role in the series after a spat with Disney over the original film using his voice for the marketing and merchandise. With both films financially successful, the scheme of turning a pilot for a Disney TV show into a film and marketing it as a sequel gave execs a plan for the future. Open new outside divisions to make more follow-ups to Disney Animation's mainline classics to be released by Disney Movie Tunes, which would be renamed Disney Toon Studios, while the main studio would work tirelessly on their next original planned for theaters. A plan that was set in motion with Beauty and the Beast: The Enchanted Christmas, set for release in 1997. But that leads us into a new question. If Disney was so keen on wanting to make sequels to their classic animated films, why didn't they have Disney Animation make them themselves? The reason is pretty simple. They weren't confident in doing so. This can be traced way back to the early days of the company, long before they started making feature films, when they still were experimenting with their animation before finally making the giant leap to the big screen. In 1933, Disney released their Silly Symphony short, Three Little Pigs, a short that took the classic fable and gave each of its characters a personality while also introducing an iconic song. The short became a massive success, earning Walt Disney another Oscar and prompting the studio to try to make more shorts with the pigs and the wolf, hoping audiences would see more. However, the new shorts failed to reach the height of its predecessor and quickly faded. Walt would keep this in mind and coined the phrase, "You can't top pigs with pigs." The failure of the subsequent 3 pig shorts stayed in Walt's mind as the animation studio transitioned into feature films, with the studio eager to keep innovating and pushing the boundaries on a different, new, and exciting story rather than expanding on their previous success, with a desire to keep moving forward, a motto that would end itself up at the end of Meet the Robinsons. Eventually, the studio did take chances on making sequels, though neither one really ended up doing well for them at the time. The first attempt was The Rescuers Down Under in 1990, after the steady success of the original from 1977, as it followed Bernard and Bianca venturing to Australia to rescue a kidnapped boy from a poacher while throwing in new characters, soaring sequences, and expanding Bernard and Bianca's relationship. Although the film got glowing reviews from critics, many of whom considered it better than the original, it vastly underperformed at the box office, due to competition from Home Alone, which was released the very same weekend. Disney Animation also revisited the idea of Fantasia at the turn of the millennium with Fantasia 2000, which brought to life Walt's original idea of creating new animated segments set to classical music to go alongside reissues of the original film. After various triumphs with the Disney Renaissance, it seemed to make sense for Disney Animation to try something more ambitious and experimental for the start of the 2000s. Though the film was made mostly as a passion project for Roy E. Disney, wanting to bring his uncle's vision to life, and much like the original film, was mainly given a limited release, this one being an IMAX exclusive. As good as the film was, it was only ever going to appeal to a limited crowd. Even if this was released today, with the interest in large film formats like IMAX thriving more than ever, I'm not sure this would have clicked with the public. So, it's no surprise the main studio was reluctant to revisit their previous efforts and expand upon them. They wanted to keep innovating and pushing the medium with further great original films. Getting back to the direct-to-video sequels, it made sense to set up a new division to try to expand on the classics. If the main studio wasn't going to do it, someone else can. But what does that mean quality-wise? Are these films any good? Well, not really. I don't think I'm going to break a whole lot of hearts saying this, but these films really are not that good. I didn't hate all of them like you might expect, but none of them really did that much to impress me. Even the ones that I found to be on the better end of the spectrum still fell short of reaching their full potential, and also had multitudes of problems I couldn't ignore, while the more infamous ones lived up to their terrible reputation and then some. These films just simply do not work. But why don't they work? It would be easy for me to quickly dismiss them and say, they're direct-to-video, duh. But I'm not gonna do that. And again, rather than look at these films individually, I'm gonna analyze them as a cohesive whole, breaking down how they fall short of reaching anything special and not building upon their predecessors' legacies in a meaningful way. The films can be broken down into 4 separate categories: sequels, prequels, midquels, and anthology films. Of the 4 categories, the anthology films are the biggest failures, and it's not hard to see why. The segments of Belle's Magical World and Atlantis Milo's Returns were initially made as TV shows based on their corresponding films, but were subsequently scrapped midway through production. And it makes sense why these never went to air. The episodes of the Beauty and the Beast show were genuinely bad, full of low-quality animation and various errors, not to mention unimpressive stories that tried to squeeze more out of Belle's time in Beast Castle.
I will never apologize!
All that to say, it was easy to see why it didn't get picked up. Meanwhile, Disney had big plans for Atlantis the Lost Empire, and was hoping to turn it into a massive franchise. However, the film divided critics and greatly underperformed at the box office, causing Disney to quickly scrap these plans. With both of these shows firmly scrapped and various completed episodes sitting on the shelves, Disney instead decided to release them straight to video as anthology films, hoping to brush their initial TV intentions under the rug. And while the films still sold like hotcakes, they could only do so much to hide the seams. Meanwhile, Tarzan and Jane tries to tie its episodes together into a cohesive plot, but it also fails due to its over-reliance on the framing device structure using the episodes as flashbacks, making it more glaringly obvious how strung together the whole thing was. To make matters worse, the show had actually gone to air, and the episodes in the film were aired on television anyway, and uncut no less, so the decision to release the episodes together as a film really made no sense. Only Cinderella 2: Dreams Come True was created as an anthology film from the ground up, but it also fails as the stories really don't amount to any sort of grand narrative or tell us anything about the characters that we didn't already know. Well, except for Anastasia, but I'll talk about that later. As for the other three categories, while they have their own particular issues, they all do suffer the same reoccurring problem that haunted these films from the very beginning. They just seem unsure how to expand the original film's story. And it's not hard to see why. The original films created at Disney Animation are pretty airtight as far as standalone films go. They keep their plots relatively simple, the characters' goals are easy to define, and it's all wrapped up nicely in a rather solid ending, usually bearing the words, happily ever after. There really aren't any loose ends left to explore any further. And boy, you can really see some of these films struggle with that. The midquels particularly. Of the many films that came out of Disney Toon Studios, these are the ones I struggled the most with, as you can see how the artist had trouble figuring out how to insert more puzzle pieces into an already completed story. Most of these narratives mainly set the story back when the protagonists were still children, which isn't a bad idea in and of itself. Tarzan 2's idea of seeing more of Tarzan's childhood before Jane and her father entered the jungle is actually a noble one, especially since there was more they could pull from the original Edgar Rice Burroughs novel, as well as seeing his growth more clearly than just the Son of Man montage. But the final film doesn't do much with it. It merely repeats information we already knew, and mostly comes off as a slog. Some of the other midquels don't really even make sense in the grand scheme of themes, particularly Beauty and the Beast, The Enchanted Christmas, and The Fox and the Hound 2, which have stories that are so ludicrous and bizarre that they really don't make a lot of sense within the original stories. The latter in particular. The Fox and the Hound 2 tries to expand Todd and Copper's childhood friendship before the latter is taken on the winter hunt, which is already a bad idea on principle, but the plot they came up with is even more ridiculous than I could have imagined, as the narrative involves the two meeting a traveling dog show band and launches a debate over whether or not Copper will join or if he'll stay with his old friend. This one really is an egregious failure. It's not just the fact that the plot is ridiculous and has nothing to do with the original story, but more importantly, it totally contradicts the main theme of the first film. The friends from your childhood will grow up and change, and more often than not, go down completely different paths than what you had planned. Todd and Copper's friendship was always going to be short-lived, and their paths diverging was inevitable. So, the idea on whether or not their friendship is going to be tested by Copper joining this band holds no weight when we know what'll eventually happen with them. And this is coming from someone who already thinks the original film is pretty flawed as is. So these midquels also had their shortcomings, but there were two that did have the most solid footing and seemed to work pretty nicely with the original films. Bambi 2 and Lion King 1.5. The former is able to piece together a narrative from a missing chapter in the timeline, the winter when Bambi loses his mother and is forced to grow up without her. The latter is a playful retelling of the original story, this time told from the perspective of Timon and Pumbaa. These are films you can conceivably say make sense within their original narratives. Granted, neither one of them really hits the bullseye, which I'll talk about later when it comes to the characters, but they do feel the most successfully integrated stories within the original film's timelines. But the midquels all still suffer the problem of trying to add more chapters to a narrative that never needed more to begin with, often recontextualizing it to the point where it loses the grand themes of the stories. But what about the actual main sequels and prequels? Why didn't they work? That was a question that was really floating through my head when watching these films, and it got me thinking back to how the original films were developed. Most of the classic Disney animation stories were adaptations, and it made me realize something. I'm surprised these films didn't reconsider the original source material for new ideas. Upon doing more research, I was pretty surprised to discover that a handful of the stories that were made into Disney Toon sequels actually were given more depth by the original authors. Bambi, Peter Pan, 101 Dalmatians, The Jungle Book, and Tarzan all had plenty of other stories created by the original authors, which could have allowed Disney to take inspiration from for these films. There was room for prequels and sequels to be developed from these stories. So, why didn't they use them? At least for a few, there was a simple reason. Copyright. Bambi's Children, The Starlight Barking, and a few of the later Tarzan stories couldn't be adapted because a few of them were still under copyright of the original author's estates, meaning that if Disney wanted to adapt them, they would have had to buy the film rights, and given the priority of having low budgets, that was out of the question. It's a genuine shame considering that had Disney adapted these stories, they'd probably get some attention. Bambi's Children expanded upon Bambi's new role as Prince of the Forest, and now has the opportunity to guide his two young sons. The Starlight Barking, meanwhile, puts the dogs on an even crazier journey than before, as it follows the Dalmatians learning about their relationship with humanity, as a dog from the stars comes down and hopes to prevent a possible nuclear war. It sounds absolutely bananas, but you know, I would have honestly paid good money to see it. I really would have. So, with adapting the book's sequels out of the question, the artists were mostly forced to rely on the original stories they had to try to spin something new out of them. This could have been a perfect opportunity for these artists to reach back into the original stories and pull out new ideas from threads that hadn't been explored. And while there were many paths they could have taken, they sadly didn't do much to take them down the right one. A few of the films just seem content on trying to repeat the original story, but only changing it just enough to make it appear different. Lady and the Tramp 2, Scant's Adventure could have given more opportunities to explore the new happy home life of the two love-struck dogs, but it opts instead to give one of their puppies his own Lady and the Tramp story, even down to giving them their own Bella Notte montage. Same story, different characters. The Little Mermaid 2 and Ariel's Beginning could have been great opportunities to learn more about Ariel as a character, with her adjusting to her new human life, or her time as a mermaid falling in love with the surface world. But instead, the former is just an inverse of the original story, but with Ariel's daughter being interested in the merpeople life rather than human life, while the latter is just essentially underwater Footloose. The theatrically released Jungle Book 2 could have allowed more characters from the original Kipling stories to enter the picture, and allowed Mowgli to look back differently on his whole childhood home and friends. But it merely has him return to the jungle to have fun with old familiar characters, and have a rematch with Shere Khan before going back to the Man Village without having really learned anything. In all, these weren't sequels that continued the original story meaningfully. They merely repeated things. It kind of reminds me a lot of these legacy sequels that we get today, like Zoolander 2 or Jurassic World Dominion, films that feel like pathetic reunion tours, only in it to make a bit more money, rather than full-on comebacks showcasing these artists' true legacies. Other sequels fare worse, with Hunchback of Notre Dame 2 and Brother Bear 2 merely existing to give their respective protagonists a love interest, while Mulan 2 trades the action and independent growth of its heroine for a boring story involving diplomatic marriage. But I'll have more to say on that one later. There's a lot to say about these missed opportunities, though I can give a bit of credit to the films that dared to not only pull something from the original source material, but also take some swings that weren't previously attempted. When it comes to reaching back to the film's original stories, both The Lion King 2, Simba's Pride, and the theatrical release Peter Pan follow-up Return to Neverland did at least make an attempt. Although in original story, The Lion King took great inspiration from the dramatic flair of William Shakespeare's Hamlet, and its sequel opted to stay in that territory by reworking another one of his most famous plays, Romeo and Juliet. And for what it's worth, this one actually does work somewhat effectively. Return to Neverland opts to look back at the original epilogue of the play, written by J.M. Barrie, but updating it to make it fit more with historical moments. In this case, having Wendy's daughter Jane need to mature faster than expected due to the clouds of the Second World War, and trying to recap her childhood whimsy. The film sadly doesn't live up to that potential, as it falls apart once she gets to Neverland, but it is a novel idea that is set up quite well. As far as new swings go, Cinderella 3, A Twist in Time, also works for trying to imagine a what-if scenario in which Cinderella's glass slipper fits someone else instead, and what she would do to make sure things worked out. It may be out of left field compared to the original film, but it's still goofy fun that does lead to some fun set pieces and sweet moments. A few of the sequels I mentioned did prove that this experiment could have worked, but there still is a major issue that held these films back. The budgets. These films were made for pennies compared to the originals and weren't given a lot of room to experiment, meaning that the artists had very little to work with and had little room to measure up to what came before. Or did they? It's not like these films were lacking talent. There were plenty of exceptionally talented artists involved. Many artists who worked at Walt Disney Animation Studios, like Anastasia, Bernie Mattinson, and even Joe Grant did pitch in to help on these films. And many of the crew members who also worked on these sequels did go on to even bigger and better things. Paul Felix, a layout artist on The Return of Jafar, eventually moved to Walt Disney Animation Studios and developed the production design and art direction on many of their beloved films, including The Emperor's New Groove, Lilo and Stitch, Big Hero 6, and Raya and the Last Dragon. Dan Scanlon worked as a storyboard artist on 101 Dalmatians 2, and eventually would move to Pixar, where he would go on to direct both Monsters University and Onward. And also, just look at the voice talent they managed to bring in. Many of the actors from the previous films did come back to reprise their roles, and for the new characters, they managed to rope in some big names. Jason Alexander, Neve Campbell, George Carlin, Tim Curry, Sally Field, Julie Kavner, Reba McEntire, Catherine O'Hara, Patrick Stewart, Jerry Stiller, Patrick Swayze, just to name a few. Heck, even Mandy Moore and Lucy Liu played characters in these films before they got to officially play characters from films from WDAS. So, it's clear the films did have talent behind them, but there's a greater fundamental problem inherent within that they never would overcome. The overwhelming pressure of trying to live up to the originals. One of the things that didn't surprise me when watching some of the behind-the-scenes clips of these films was to see many of the artists talk about their anxiety of living up to the classics' reputations.
It was very intimidating in the beginning to start working on that, and the only way I could see doing it is to be as true as we possibly could to it.
I think we were doing something that everybody said you couldn't do. It's probably the most, endearing and revered movie Disney has, practically.
I remember getting started on it. I was actually thinking, I don't think I can do this. I mean, I've been animating for almost 25 years now, but it's a big deal. It's just a big deal.
It honestly reminded me of the anxiety that people at Disney Animation faced in the 80s. The fear that their new films would never live up to the heights of the classics, rather than the fear they should have been feeling whether or not the film would be good. And despite all the talk of trying to recapture the look and feeling of the originals, the sequels never do. It's not just the limiting budgets that hold back the animation, but it's also the loss of the little touches that could have and should have been captured in the sequels. The Lion King 1.5 tries to insert Timon and Pumbaa into moments throughout the first film in a hilarious manner, but it fails to understand certain touches to specific moments, namely the I Just Can't Wait to Be King number. The scene in the original, designed brilliantly by Chris Sanders, is shown to be bright and colorful with all the animals designed in an exaggerated and cartoony way, which showcases Simba's playful imagination of what he thinks his future entails. The backgrounds during this moment in Lion King 1.5 are also like this, but it makes no sense since the colorful backgrounds in cartoony animals are strictly from Simba's point of view. Why are Timon and Pumbaa also in this colorful environment, even though Simba hasn't even met them yet? The film also has the problem of trying to put the animation from the original film alongside the newer animation, and it's not very hard to spot the difference. Lady and the Tramp 2 tries to recapture the cozy vintage look that Claude Coates gave the original, but it fails to recapture its main pull, that being the film's framing from Lady's point of view. The original is a nostalgic look at late 1900s America, a time of prosperity and peace before the overwhelming world events of the 1910s. And the film shows this by keeping its focus on the dogs and the world around them rather than the people who own them, which the film relishes in by keeping the camera low to make it feel like a dog's point of view. It's why we don't get a lot of looks at the humans' faces. The sequel, however, fails to recreate this touch, resulting in the film losing both the warm, nostalgic look and feel, as well as the clever framing that pulls us into Lady's world. Cinderella 3 tries to recreate the inspired and bold look of Mary Blair, but fails to understand the elegance of the locations she designed so wonderfully. The palace in the original film was designed to look warm, open, and inviting, a freeing environment for the protagonist as a contrast to the cramped and cold look of the chateau, which is framed as a prison. The sequel loses that open environment, with the palace feeling about as elegant as the chateau, cloaked in shadow, cramped, and just not inviting. 101 Dalmatians 2 tries to recreate the stylized Xerox look designed by Ken Anderson, but loses its atmosphere in the process. The original film basks in bold black outlines on its background and a moodier color palette, helping give its world a modern and atmospheric tone that made it feel more timeless. The sequel trades it for softer lines and warmer colors, making the film feel far too slick and polished. Ironic to think that an animated film with budgetary restrictions can't recreate the look of an animated film whose look was defined by budgetary restrictions. Even the songs have no sticking power, with all of them being completely forgettable and unimpressive. Though not having memorable songs, losing animation details, and failing to expand the story are all significant issues, there's one thing that these sequels tend to struggle with most of all, which is the thing that any good sequel needs to do. And that's really expand and grow the characters from the previous films while throwing in some new ones to the story that feel like they belong. If these sequels had a so-called Achilles heel, it's easily the character development, because none of the characters ever feel properly expanded from before. Most of the time, the protagonists from the original are sidelined in favor of secondary characters who were never really interesting to begin with. Lady and the Tramp 2 shifts focus from the two dogs that fall in love in favor of the duo's titular son Scamp and a street dog who can best be described as a tomboy version of the Tramp. 101 Dalmatians 2 shifts the spotlight away from Pongo and Perdita, and even the Radcliffes, in favor of one of their puppies just trying to seek individualism. Which is kind of hypocritical of the film, given that none of the other puppies, particularly the 84 that were adopted by Pongo and Perdita, have individual personalities. Other times, the films have no idea how to expand the protagonists, as is the case with the Beauty and the Beast midquels and Cinderella sequels. Neither Belle nor Cinderella are given any development about them that we couldn't already figure out ourselves based on what we know. We already know Belle is a kind bookworm who is going to melt the Beast's heart and help him break the spell. What difference does it make that she gets him to appreciate Christmas? We also know that Cinderella got her happily ever after with the prince and was able to leave behind her abusive household. Who cares that we see her want to make an impression on the king, who we know is already bound to like her? These are not interesting paths to take the characters, and quite frankly, I'm not surprised the filmmakers struggled to figure out how to give them more expansive arcs. That being said, there were ways some of these sequels could have taken their character arcs, but instead, some of them really just go backwards. As mentioned previously, sequels like Hunchback of Notre Dame 2 and Brother Bear 2 only exist to give their respective protagonists a love interest instead of allowing them to learn more about the respective new worlds they live in. Hunchback is especially frustrating, as it throws Quasimodo back into the bell tower of Notre Dame, which basically undoes his whole journey of finding acceptance in society in the first film. So, what's the point? There's other times where the films do try to give more to the characters, and while these certainly aren't bad expansions and are noble attempts, there are moments that really do damage to what made them so special in the first film. Lilo and Stitch 2 does at least make the effort to give more to Lilo by showing her trying to fit in while showcasing her passion for hula dancing, but it also does the opposite in regards to Stitch. The original is a showcase in proving that a character who's born naughty and out of control can learn compassion and find belonging. It's a great message to show to kids, knowing that the family and people around you can make an impact on how you are, which helps Stitch grow feel genuine and earned. The sequel, however, tries to show that Stitch's naughty nature was a result of Jumba not being able to fully program him correctly, which goes against his growth in the first film. Bambi 2 tries to expand more the relationship between Bambi and his father, but it detracts from the mystery and intimidation that the latter has in the original. In the original film, the Great Prince was an intimidating figure of size and power, and a reflection on who Bambi is poised to grow up to be. You can make the argument that this character is essentially a reflection of his older self who stands proudly as the leader of the forest. The sequel robs him of that intrigue, giving him an arc of just being a stubborn father figure whose sternness melts away as the film progresses.
Bambi, a prince awakens before the forest does. A prince maintains control at all times. A prince does not look back. A prince does not woo-hoo.
Mom, it's just my bow.
And then there's Lion King 1.5. A film that is mostly solid and does give Timon a decent backstory, which is pulled from a deleted verse from Hakuna Matata, but has a small moment that really does damage to his characterization in the first film. In the original film, after Simba returns to Pride Rock to fight Scar for his place as rightful king, he finds that Timon and Pumbaa have also arrived to help fight alongside Nala.
Well, Simba, if it's important to you, we're with you to the end.
It's a great moment, one that showcases the friendship and loyalty they have towards Simba that proves he is the rightful king of Pride Rock and gives him the edge over Scar, a character who manipulated his way to the top and is unloyal to his servants and his followers, especially knowing he'll eventually betray the hyenas. In Lion King 1.5, though, it's shown that after Nala explains Simba's story to the duo, Timon is shown to be angry over him leaving and initially refuses to go back.
He needs us? Then he shouldn't have left us. If he wants to run off to be His Highness, well, I say, don't let the branches hit you on the way out.
Yeah, it's good to know that the loyalty that Timon has for Simba only comes after Rafiki gives him a pep talk. Like, wow, that is really selfish. But more often than not, these characters rarely come across as the ones we got to know and love before. And in some cases, they're somehow worse. And there was no film that did this more egregiously than Mulan 2. The film tries to expand the characters more than before, even though it puts them on a smaller quest compared to the massive journey in the original. But boy, does this sequel really do them dirty. Mulan's growth in the first film is a matter of not only finding an identity in her family, but showcasing her selflessness by helping save China, both by taking her father's place and saving Shen and his men as well as the Emperor before Shan Yu can make his final attack. The sequel, however, makes her actions more selfish as she encourages the three princesses to date her friends instead of the pre-arranged marriage, resulting in China being in an uneasy relationship with the kingdom that planned the marriage. It's really awful, but that's nothing compared to how Mushu is handled. Mushu in the original film was a lovable, if clumsy, comic relief character who journeys with Mulan as a promise to her family to keep her safe. The sequel, though, has him deliberately sabotaging Mulan's plans to marry Shang in order for him to keep his position safe. I really do not understand why they did this. Not only does it fail to expand either character, but it really does damage to the strides both made in the original film, turning their selfless and bold decisions into ones that are selfish and vindictive. If anything, it is a textbook example of going against what made the original film special. The villains also come up short. Some of them are merely pale retreads of the original villains, with both of the Little Mermaid films simply coming up with characters that both just come across as a poor man's Ursula. Other times, though, the films bring back the original villains, but the most they ever get in terms of motivation is, well, revenge. Jafar, revenge. Cruella, revenge. Shere Khan, revenge. Lady Tremaine, you guessed it,
Revenge.
It's pretty lazy, and it's a clear sign that these artists had a hard time figuring out how to expand these characters. And the same can even be said for their cronies. For whatever reason, these sequels have a habit of giving secondary villains redemption arcs, but pretty much none of them are truly earned, and they all go against how they acted in the original. Jasper and Horace were created to be goons working for Cruella for money and nothing else. It's also shown that neither of them are bright or really care about anything apart from the television. So not only is there no reason for them to help Cruella make a fur coat again, but there's not much reason for them to be redeemed at the end. Iago was created to be an obnoxious, loudmouth parrot assistant to Jafar. It's clear that sometimes he can't stand working for his master, but to be fair, that's something plenty of folks can relate to. Either way, giving him a redemption arc and having him help Aladdin and Jasmine just seems to come out of nowhere. But there is one redemption arc that does feel earned, and it is the one character who was given growth that critics and Disney fans have rightfully applauded. Anastasia. Out of all the characters in all the sequels that returned, this is the one character I really latched onto in terms of development, and the one I thought was fleshed out the best. And the reason why is simple. It doesn't feel like it came out of nowhere, and it honestly felt natural. I stated earlier that while one of the shortcomings of these sequels was the inability to pull more out of the original text, the Cinderella sequels were able to do so with Anastasia. The original fairy tale by Charles Perrault indicated that while Cinderella's stepfamily was pretty abusive to her, the younger stepsister did treat her more kindly compared to her older sister and mother. And when watching the original Cinderella, you can effectively make that case for Anastasia. Granted, she's certainly no saint in that film, she still does help rip that dress, but compared to Lady Tremaine and Drizella, she isn't nearly as hurtful to Cinderella. The only time she really does anything to her is when she complains to Lady Tremaine after finding Gus tucked away under her teacup. But to be fair, that action was Lucifer's fault, and also, I can't blame her for that reaction. If I found a mouse under my teacup, I would freak out too. But the rest of the time, Drizella is the one who instigates the abuse. She says more hurtful things to her, she usually is the one who starts mocking her first, and she's the first one to tear up Cinderella's dress. So, when it came to the sequels, the decision to give Anastasia a redemption arc didn't feel out of the blue due to how she behaved in the original film, and also its origins in the fairy tale. And for what it's worth, the artists do handle her growth well. Both of the sequels showcase her hoping to one day truly fall in love like her stepsister, and wanting to do right despite what her mother and sister think. And eventually, she's able to realize the horrible manipulation that both of them have inflicted on her and breaks free of it, making amends with Cinderella and wanting to start anew. It's really sweet, and it is also a good message to teach kids. Sometimes the people who were horrible to you can change and do better. I wish the other films could have fleshed out these characters like what they did with Anastasia, but hey, at least they got one right. Throughout my journey of going through these films, seeing how they were made and released, and figuring out why they don't stack up, there was one sequel that was initially developed for this strange lineup of movies that ended up not only taking on a whole new life on its own, but greatly eclipsed all the others. Toy Story 2. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about why this film works so well as a sequel compared to the other films that I've talked about, nor do I want to discuss how Pixar fits into this matter, that's a story for another video, but I bring it up here because it does play a role in these films' legacies. And the reason why is simple. Toy Story was initially considered part of the major Disney animation catalog. Although it was created and produced at Pixar and was very much their own film, it was always first and foremost going to be sold as a Disney film. It's why it was initially part of the infamous Disney Vault, why on early VHS releases the film is labeled as Disney's Toy Story, and why Pixar's famous Luxo Jr. logo only shows up at the very end of the credits. Even the original artwork developed for the film was stored in Disney's own animation archives in Burbank after production, until Pixar was purchased in 2006 when the art was reunited with the studio in Emeryville. Disney basically could have done whatever they wanted with Toy Story since they owned the property wholesale, and given that Return of Jafar had already made millions on home video, a direct-to-video Toy Story sequel seemed to make perfect sense. And although Disney could have given the film to an outside vendor to make, they ultimately decided to partner with Pixar again to bring it to life in 1997. The film was to be animated by a smaller team within Pixar, created from the Shuttered Computer Games group, while the major team would be at work developing new originals for Disney with both A Bug's Life and Monsters, Inc. However, after seeing the work in progress on Toy Story 2, Disney was impressed enough by the film's quality to upgrade it to a theatrical release in 1998. Though the film was still not to be considered part of the 5-film deal Pixar had originally signed with Disney. And despite having one of the most chaotic productions that an animated film would ever have, the film would arrive in theaters in 1999 to even greater acclaim and success than its predecessor. There's a lot to say about why Toy Story 2 works so well compared to the other films I mentioned earlier, but I think it mainly boils down to a simple decision that ultimately saved the movie. The original creators made it themselves. Unlike the other direct-to-video sequels, everything about Toy Story 2 was given an upgrade. The story was grander than before. The animation continued to expand the look originally set in stone by the late Ralph Eggleston, showcasing more dangerous places for the toys to go to. And the characters were given much more depth and given arcs that expanded rather than repeated. The movie is fantastic, and its high quality helped it overcome its direct-to-video origins and cement its status as not just one of the greatest animated sequels ever made, but one of the best sequels ever made. You'd think that with this success, Disney would learn the right lessons on how to improve these sequels going forward. But of course, that's not what happened. Instead, they decided to try putting some of the other planned direct-to-video films from Disney Toon Studios in theaters, hoping to get the same results. However, neither Return to Neverland nor Jungle Book 2 would have the same critical or financial success Toy Story 2 had, and Disney would ultimately scrap plans to release other direct-to-video sequels like Lilo and Stitch 2 theatrically. But by that point in time, the movies were very much on life support. By 2005, Disney's direct-to-video sequel plans were stronger than ever, as the films were still raking in plenty of money. The same could not be said for their other animation divisions, though. The main division had hit rock bottom once again, with many of their films being played by field experimentation and executive meddling, resulting in the films getting poor initial reviews and bombing at the box office. At the same time, Pixar also had gotten fed up with the studio, with talks between them and Disney breaking down before the release of The Incredibles, and they began a search to find a new distributor to release future original films, Ratatouille, WALL-E, and Up, while Disney planned to make their own sequels to Pixar's films under a controversial new division named Circle 7. The television animation division was not faring much better either, as they weren't delivering as many successful shows compared to the massive successes being aired on Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network. That left these direct-to-video sequels from Disney Toon Studios as the only things Disney had going for it animation-wise, and if films this bad were the only things making money, that's not a good sign. By 2006, Disney began to course correct following the resignation of Michael Eisner. They eventually purchased Pixar and transferred its management over to Disney's own struggling divisions. Both Ed Catmull and John Lasseter made it clear they were not fans of the direct-to-video sequels, and instantly began cleaning house with the closure of Circle 7, the complete restructuring of Disney Animation, and finally putting an end to the line of direct-to-video sequels made by Disney Toon. Cinderella 3 and Ariel's Beginning were both completed and released, as their productions were already too far ahead to be scrapped, while other sequels to films such as Dumbo, The Aristocats, and Chicken Little were completely axed. By 2008, Disney's direct-to-video sequels were officially dead. Disney Toon Studios wouldn't last much longer either. After producing a series of direct-to-video films featuring Tinkerbell, as well as releasing 2 films spun off from the Cars universe called Planes, the studio was shuttered in 2018, alongside the cancellation of a 3rd Plane film following Lasseter's resignation after allegations of sexual misconduct broke out against him. Personally, I think the decision to cancel these films was the correct one, and it's not simply because these films were bad. I just don't think there was going to be a future with them. By the late 2000s, most other film companies had given up making direct-to-video animated sequels due to declining quality and lack of interest. Around this time, Netflix was already beginning to set up its streaming service, which would change the way films and shows could be watched in the 2010s. It also goes without saying, but by then, Disney's other animation studios were putting out material far better than anyone could have imagined. WDAS would yet again rebound, launching itself into another golden age of animated films in an era since coined the Disney Revival, spawning plenty of classics that would become instant staples. The television animation division also experienced a massive boom, with TV shows that would go on to become some of the best ever created and launch the careers of beloved animation creators. And Pixar just kept chugging along, still making animated films at the top of their game. Even if the new management were eager to keep the direct-to-video sequels going, I can't imagine they would have been that successful in the 2010s, knowing that this landscape wasn't going to be the same as when they started. The market was dying, streaming was just around the corner, and there were better animated films and shows people could be watching instead. The end of these films being made was inevitable. But the question I had at the start of this journey still remains. Were these sequels really that bad? And it honestly might surprise you when I say this, but no, they really weren't. Don't get me wrong, most of these films were not good, and many of them definitely live up to their horrible reputations. And while I did get some enjoyment out of a handful of them, namely the 2 Lion King sequels, Bambi 2 and Cinderella 3, none of them properly function as sequels and are just too flawed for me to fully endorse. But despite all the criticisms I've thrown at these films, I don't really think they deserve the visceral hatred and scorn they've gotten since they started. Because at the end of the day, these films have never done any damage to Disney Animation's prestigious filmography. The sequels may have done a lot of bad things, but the one thing you can't say they did is harm the legacy of the classics. The original films are still being talked about highly by filmmakers and audiences. They're still used as an influence on new animated classics, and their legacy as great art will shine into the future. A bad sequel is not going to undo a predecessor's brilliant legacy. Just look at the vast number of films nominated for Best Picture. Plenty of them have gotten sequels, and while a few have endured, most of them have not. But they've never harmed the impact of the films that came before. To put it simply, Disney Animation has done what they've always set out to do. They kept moving forward. Both WDAS and the television animation division have occasionally revisited the past, though not too far. With the exception of Winnie the Pooh in 2011, WDAS and DTVA have since only revisited films from the Revival era, with the latter making TV series out of Tangled and Big Hero 6, while the former developed feature film sequels to Wreck-It Ralph, Frozen, Moana, and Zootopia. However you feel about the quality of any of these is subject to debate. I've personally enjoyed the sequels WDAS have made recently, save for Moana 2, but that's beside the point. I think sticking with the recent era is a smart one, as there are enough threads in these recent films that can be expanded upon compared to the films from the past. And I don't think Disney has any plans to revisit any of the earlier efforts anytime soon. So, what can be said about these films? Well, simply put, they were a fad. A trend that was always going to be short-lived and looked back on in confusion and embarrassment. Though in all seriousness, it's hard to get mad at these films when their initial goal was already small to begin with. Return to Jafar was always meant to be viewed as a TV pilot rather than a proper follow-up to Aladdin. It's not a good TV pilot, but that's all it is. A TV pilot. Not an actual sequel worth getting mad over. It's kind of why I found it ridiculous that everyone got so mad at Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate. Obviously, it's bad and far from the quality of the original movie, but it was never meant to be seen as a proper sequel, but rather just the unimpressive launch of a TV show. So, yeah, it goes without saying that the direct-to-video Disney sequels do not deserve the infamous legacy they have. And I think Roger Ebert summed it up better than I could have when he reviewed The Lion King 2.
I think you used the right word in your intro to this review when you said it was satisfactory.
Yeah.
It's more or less what you are hoping for or expecting as a made-for-video sequel to The Lion King. It's not at the level of the theatrical releases that Disney does, but on the other hand, if you're interested in what happened to the characters, you want to see kind of a Romeo and Juliet scenario played out in the Serengeti, then it's fun on that level.
These films were only ever going to be somewhat satisfactory. They tried to deliver some entertainment for the modestly curious, but they were never going to fully endure with the true power of the originals. At the end of the day, they were harmless failed experiments poorly masquerading as proper follow-ups. And I don't envy any of the artists who had the challenge of bringing them to life. They tried their best, and at least they could go on to bigger and better things. But the true power of the original films from Disney Animation has endured with time because of the effort of the original motto to keep moving forward with making entertainment for all ages. And that's always going to endure. These films are pure magic for me. And great films are always like that.